On August 4, 1892, Abby and Andrew Borden were found hacked to death in their Falls River, Massachusetts, home. Lizzie was tried and acquitted for their murders, though speculation about her possible guilt continues to this day. For the most part, this is where common knowledge about the enigmatic woman ends. But, of course, there's more to the mystery. Lizzie's biological mother, Sarah Borden, also mother to Lizzie's older sister, Emma, died in 1863. In 1866, Lizzie's father, Andrew Borden, married Abby Durfee Gray. Lizzie and Abby were not close. Lizzie apparently believed that Abby was after her father's money. According to the Bordens' live-in maid, Lizzie and Emma rarely took meals with their father and stepmother. Furthermore, in the months before the murders, Andrew had been giving away pieces of real estate to Abby's family, which likely caused a highly tense situation in the Borden home. Andrew was a notable penny pincher. Despite his considerable wealth, the Bordens lived in a comparably small home, with no indoor plumbing on the ground and second floors, and only one maid. This frugality apparently also carried over to his business dealings, and he had many enemies, so many, in fact, that Lizzie had once expressed that she feared for his safety because of how discourteous he was. The coroner said that Abby Borden was given 19 whacks, not 40, as the rhyme suggests. Andrew was taken out by only 10 or 11. Furthermore, the Bordens were attacked by blows with a hatchet or hatchet-like weapon, not the infamous axe. Investigators later agreed that whoever killed the Bordens would have been covered in blood after the slaying. If Lizzie was indeed the killer, she would have had to do the following: kill Abby, change and hide her blood-soaked clothes, go downstairs, talk with the maid for 30 minutes, kill her father, change once again, hide her clothes and the murder weapon, which was also never conclusively identified, and then sound the alarm about the attack. Needless to say, the timeline is difficult to accept. What's more, Lizzie would not only have had to change out of her bloody clothes, she would have had to bathe and scrub her skin clean of blood. Given her father's cheapness, the family, as previously mentioned, had no indoor plumbing. Taking a bath would not have been a speedy or simple process. There was no physical evidence tying Lizzie to the crime. This being said, it's important to note that while fingerprinting did exist in 1892, it was new, and authorities were reluctant to use it. In fact, in the Borden murder case, they didn't. The jury acquitted Lizzie after deliberating for just an hour and a half. The trial began on June 5, 1893, and ended on June 20. Lizzie was shunned after the trial, even though she was acquitted. Lizzie stayed in Falls River after the trial, moving into a large house with her sister. Despite her acquittal, she was ostracized from the Falls River community and society at large. Public dislike for Lizzie Borden only increased when she made headlines again in 1897. This time, she was accused of shoplifting in Rhode Island. Borden was ill in her last year following the removal of her gallbladder. She died of pneumonia on June 1, 1927, in Fall River. It was the murder case that sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. In 1894, Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen married his second wife, a woman by the name of Corinne Cora Turner. The pair met in New York, where Dr. Crippen practiced as a homeopath and worked for Mugnon's homeopathic pharmaceutical company. Cora was a music hall singer who performed under the stage name Belle Elmore. Her lively persona stood in stark contrast to the gentle and bespectacled Dr. Crippen. Cora was also supposedly promiscuous, conducting several open affairs. In 1897, the pair moved to England, where Crippen continued his work with Mugnon's pharmaceuticals. Not long after the move, however, Crippen lost his job, reportedly, for spending too much time managing his wife's stage career. He found employment as the manager of Druitt's Institute for the Deaf, around 1903, but the pay was a far cry from his prior position. The couple took lodgers to supplement their income, and Cora struck up a romantic relationship with one of the house guests. Crippen, meanwhile, had met Ethel Leneve. Ethel was a secretary at Druitt's Institute for the Deaf. She soon became Crippen's mistress, as well as his alleged co-conspirator in the murder of his wife. In 1910, after a party at their home, Cora disappeared. Crippen initially claimed that she had returned to the United States, where she subsequently died and was cremated. Meanwhile, Ethel Leneve moved in with Crippen and was seen wearing his late wife's clothes and jewelry. Crippen's house was searched by the authorities, and Crippen himself was interviewed, during which time he admitted to Chief Inspector Walter Dew that he made up the story about Cora's death. He claimed he was humiliated, as Cora had supposedly fled to America with one of her lovers. Authorities initially bought Crippen's claims. Not long after the interview, however, Crippen and Leneve boarded a ship called the Montrose, bound for Canada. The couple's hasty departure led the authorities to conduct another, more thorough search of Crippen's house. This time around, they found a human torso, missing its head, arms, and legs, entombed under the brick floor of the basement. By now, news broke of the murder case. Crippen and Leneve had boarded the Montrose under assumed identities, with Crippen as the father and Leneve, disguised as a boy, pretending to be Crippen's son. The charade failed to convince the ship's captain, who recognized the fugitives and sent a message via wireless to the authorities. Inspector Dew boarded a faster ship, the SS Laurentic, and successfully beat the Montrose to Canada. He met Dr. Crippen on board as the Montrose entered the St. Lawrence River. When the inspector confronted him, Crippen replied, "Thank God it's over." The suspense has been too great, then held out his wrists to be cuffed. It was the first time in history a suspect had been apprehended with the help of radio technology. During Crippen's trial, the defense maintained his story that his wife had fled to America with another man. They pointed out that the prosecution couldn't even positively identify the gender of the body in Crippen's basement, let alone determine if it was Cora. One of the key pieces of evidence presented by pathologists on behalf of the prosecution was a piece of skin with what appeared to be abdominal scar tissue, which was consistent with Cora's medical history. Furthermore, drugs like scopolamine and hyoscine were found in the remains, which Crippen had, in fact, purchased prior to the murder. It took the jury only 27 minutes of deliberation to find Crippen guilty of the murder of his wife. He was hanged on November 23, 1910. At Crippen's request, a photograph of Leneve was placed in his coffin with him when he was buried. For her part, Ethel Leneve was charged only as an accessory after the fact. She moved to the United States on the same day that her lover was executed. The high-profile and transatlantic nature of the crime made Crippen something of a household name. The case inspired stories and novels by the likes of Arthur Machen, Ernest Raymond, and Eric Larson, as well as several film and television adaptations. A waxwork figure of Dr. Crippen even found its way into the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds in London. Still, there have long been doubts about Crippen's actual guilt. Crime novelist Raymond Chandler famously commented that it seemed impossible to imagine that Crippen would be so successful at disposing of the head and limbs of his wife, and yet leave her torso under the floor of his own cellar. Furthermore, in 2007, a forensic scientist working at Michigan State University ran DNA tests against a slide containing a sample of flesh, taken from the corpse found in Crippen's cellar. The tests supposedly showed that the remains belonged to a male person, though the veracity of this conclusion has been questioned. Several people have argued, in the light of this new evidence, that the case should be reopened and Crippen posthumously pardoned. So far, little progress has been made, leaving the question of Cora's fate and Crippen's guilt a mystery. If you were a young woman living in Hungary in the 16th century, you wanted to stay well away from the castle of Countess Elizabeth Bathory. For 24 years, the Countess amused herself by torturing and killing young girls. She started with girls from peasant families who came to work as servants. When the peasants wised up and began hiding their daughters, she moved up the social scale, luring daughters of the local gentry by offering them etiquette lessons. Rumors that she bathed in the blood of virgins to keep herself youthful were never proved. But the rest of her horrific crimes were chronicled in gory detail at her trial. She well deserves her nickname, the Blood Countess. She came to the area after becoming betrothed to Count Ferenc Nadasdy at 11 years old. He was 16. Ferenc was an athlete and soldier, although not a scholar, as his own mother once admitted, and he was considered a hero during the long war against the Turks. Elizabeth and Ferenc shared many things, including a handful of children, the family estate in Cactus, and a sick love of debasing their maids. While Ferenc served in the military, whispers of Elizabeth's penchant for domestic abuse spread wherever she traveled. She hired a team of personal assistants, including 3 older women, a disfigured young boy, and a sadistic, reputed witch, named Anna Darvelia, who spearheaded the torture squad and eventually became Elizabeth's lover. Elizabeth and Anna used a variety of techniques to torment the lesser servants. In winter, they would take a girl out into the snow, pour cold water on her until it turned to ice, and then leave her there to freeze to death. During the spring, they would spread honey on a girl's naked body, then tie her down outside, so bees and bugs would eat away at her. They also shoved needles under fingernails, sewed mouths shut, and clubbed girls with razor-sharp weapons until they perished. Other servants witnessed these crimes, and they swore Elizabeth started ingesting victims' blood as part of dark rituals, which spun into tales of vampirism. Yet others claimed that after an exceptionally brutal beating, she discovered the regenerating effects of bodily fluid on the skin and started bathing in it to stay beautiful for her beloved husband. But when Ferenc succumbed to an infection and died at a young age in 1604, Elizabeth absolutely lost it. She took permanent residence in Cactus, locking herself in her mansion, and had girls kidnapped from the village and brought to her home. Oftentimes she was too depressed to get out of bed, so Anna would bring the helpless child to Elizabeth, and she would bite chunks out of their faces and then have them burned. Eventually, she ran out of common girls to torture, and she started picking off daughters from the nobility who had less money than the rest. Finally, the Hungarian king decided he couldn't turn a blind eye to this royal abuse of power, so he sent his lieutenants to arrest the serial killer and put her on trial. When they arrived at her castle, they found bodies, some alive, some dead, strewn around various rooms, partially burned in fireplaces, and buried in shallow graves on the grounds. This evidence, compiled with testimony from more than 300 villagers and confessions from her core group of confidants, resulted in a guilty verdict. Elizabeth Bathory was convicted of 80 murders, although a legendary diary entry brought the total closer to 650. While Anna the Witch and her team of torturers were executed for their crimes, Elizabeth was allowed to remain in her castle, albeit behind brick wall permanently erected at her door. For years later, she passed away in her sleep. The villagers in Cactus rioted when her body was buried in their town. She was reportedly moved to the Bathory family crypt in eastern Hungary, although when the site was excavated in 1995, her body was nowhere to be found. Fascination with Bathory's horrific crimes continues to this day, and she remains a prominent figure in popular culture. In the television show, American Horror Story, Coven, the character Delphine LaLaurie, played by Kathy Bates, is inspired by the real-life New Orleans killer from the 1830s who tortured and murdered her slaves. LaLaurie's crimes were compared to those of the Blood Countess, so much so that she's often called the American Elizabeth Bathory. In AHS, details from Bathory's life are woven into the LaLaurie storyline. Much like Bathory's morbid love of bathing in blood, the show's ruthless woman uses the blood of her servants in an attempt to retain her youth and beauty. Bathory is also the central figure in Andrei Codresca's novel The Blood Countess, which explores the eternal allure of Bathory's bloody reign. The inventive novel blends horror with historical fiction and family drama as it follows journalist Drake Bathory Korestu, who's haunted by the fact that his bloodline leads back to the infamous murderess. The French Quarter of New Orleans has long been steeped in tales of ghosts and the occult. But sometimes the living citizens are more terrifying than the dead. Born to an influential white Creole family, Delphine McCarty was raised with the finer things life had to offer. The young socialite, who even the Queen of Spain found beautiful, blended with the upper class, as seamlessly as she wove herself through 3 marriages, first to a Spanish diplomat, then a prominent banker, and finally to the city's only dentist, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalaurie. In 1831, although uncommon at the time, Madame Lalaurie purchased property in her own name at 1140 Rue Royale. She proceeded to build the mansion of her dreams, and her husband and daughters moved in soon after it was finished. While modest from the outside, the 3-story building was lavishly decorated inside with carved mahogany wood, massive chandeliers, and fabrics imported from Asia. The mansion housed separate slaves' quarters on the top floor. Naturally, Madame Lalaurie's home became the focal point of New Orleans high society. She threw parties and balls where guests, like her cousin, the mayor, dined on fancy European china and admired the famous artwork on her walls. An invitation to a Lalaurie gala became the most coveted item in town. Yet, beneath the grandiose surface existed an evil mind that would expose itself in due time. Rumors began to spread of Madame Lalaurie's short temper and mistreatment of her slaves. Often referred to as the Savage Mistress, Madame Lalaurie gained a bad reputation for her severe and callous treatment of her slaves. Madame Lalaurie's slaves were often noticed as appearing haggard, but in public, she was polite to black people and was attentive toward her slaves' well-being. However, local authorities were sent to check on her household and make sure she was following laws. They couldn't find anything amiss, but neighbors continued to suspect that something sinister was happening on the top floor. Madame Lalaurie's slaves would come and go far too quickly. One day, neighbors heard a commotion in the Lalaurie backyard. Madame Lalaurie's 12-year-old slave Leah had hit a snag while combing her mistress's hair, and Madame Lalaurie was not happy about it. The older woman chased the girl down to the courtyard, then the girl turned and ran back up to the top floor. Leah backed herself up against the balcony railing in an attempt to avoid punishment, but she ended up falling, although some say she threw herself to the pavement below and died. The Lalauries hurried to collect the girl's body and bury her on their property, but the damage to their reputation was done. After word spread of the incident with Leah, an investigation was conducted on the Lalauries, where they were found guilty of illegal cruelty. Madame Lalaurie was arrested and was forced to let go of 9 slaves. They were put up for auction. Being the powerful woman she was, Madame Lalaurie was able to get off with just a fine. As for her slaves, she asked relatives to buy them and return them to her, a request which they happily obliged. Despite regaining her status as slave mistress, Lalaurie's stature in upper Creole society began to spiral downward. Her neighbors had already lost respect for her and started to decline party invitations. On April 10, 1834, the community's worst fears were realized when a fire broke out in the Lalaurie kitchen. Fire marshals rushed to stop the blaze and found an elderly woman chained to the room's fireplace. They immediately cut her free and hurried her to safety, only to hear her confess that she started the fire as a suicide attempt. She said Madame Lalaurie had threatened to take her up to the top floor. According to the elderly cook, any slave who was taken upstairs never returned. Neighbors, who had come over to help put out the fire, started wondering why Madame Lalaurie's servants weren't assisting the fire marshals. When Madame Lalaurie heard this, she famously replied, "Never mind the servants, save my valuables. This way, gentlemen, this way." But after hearing the old cook's story, the authorities knew they had to keep searching the house. They went to the top floor, broke down the doors, and came face to face with a grisly sight: over a dozen slaves, some chained to the wall, others in cages. Many were suspended by their necks and badly mutilated with various scars. Some had bloody welts, living in gruel, and wearing iron collars with inward-facing spikes. According to newspaper stories, body parts were scattered across the floor, organs and heads piled in buckets. Still, more were stretched by their limbs, hanging on for dear life. The once helpful group of neighbors morphed into a ferocious mob, appalled at the atrocities committed on their own street. A mob of about 4,000 people ransacked the house, looting and pillaging as they went. Everyone was enraged and disgusted by Madame Lalaury's extreme form of punishment. They ransacked the mansion and nearly demolished it. Madame Lalaury's husband Louis, who had ignored his wife's wickedness, hadn't been home when the fire started. He must have heard about the rioting though, because he left the area and was never heard from again. The criminal herself fled immediately to the port, jumping on a ship and leaving behind the glamour and prestige she had taken a life to build. Little is known of her after that. Rumors circulated that she went to Europe and came back to New Orleans later in life. Records show she died in Paris in 1849, although her body was later exhumed and moved back to her hometown. We might never know what actually happened to Madame Lalaury in the end. It is quite a mystery. Nonetheless, she became a legend of gore and horror for tour operators within the past century. She moved to Paris to live a quiet, harmless life, no longer with rage. So what had come to her all those years before? Was it a mental illness? A demon? Was she a monster of some sort? Guess we will never know for sure. Today, ghost stories are still told about the people who died in the Lalaury mansion, and the now private home is a stop on numerous haunted tours of the city. Madame Lalaury has inspired many twisted stories, most famously Kathy Bates's character on American Horror Story, Coven. The only evidence that her body still exists is a simple plaque in the deeply haunted New Orleans Cemetery No. 1. It reads, Madame Lalaury, née Marie Delphine McCarty, décédée à Paris, le 7 December, 1842, à l'âge de 6. Amelia Dyer may have started her career as respectfully as a baby farmer could, but her care soon transformed into terror for the poor infants she took under her wing. Years passed before the so-called caregiver was finally exposed as the ogress of reading, by which point she had claimed a shockingly high number of young lives. In Victorian Britain, unmarried mothers strived to stay afloat. With the passage of the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, fathers of illegitimate children no longer had a financial obligation to their offspring, which left unmarried mothers struggling to find any income. It was difficult to bring up children during Victorian society. Single parenthood and illegitimacy were looked down upon. This led to the practice of baby farming. While many businesses were set up to take in young women and care for them until they gave birth, some unsavory operations had other plans. There could be lucrative financial gain if the baby had well-off parents. Sometimes, a newborn was sent away in secret, hiding a scandalous or unwanted pregnancy. However, those who desperately needed the services were primarily impoverished women. During the 19th century, adoption, foster care, and outnursing were normal practices across England. Mothers and families paid these institutions to take in and care for their newborns. Often, this was done out of desperation. Impoverished new mothers, unable to afford long-term childcare, would pay the comparatively lower charge to send away their child. Yet wealthier families also paid for other similar services. Sometimes, newborns were sent to nearby villages to be cared for in their early years, returning to the family when they were toddlers. In a rather well-known example, Jane Austen's family was accustomed to sending their children to a wet nurse in a nearby village for the beginning months of an infant's life. Jane spent a fair amount of time with her parents in the beginning, but was in the care of a nurse for the first 2 years of her life. These wet nurses were reputable, even a part of the family in many ways, and her mother and father visited regularly. Later, James Edward Austen, Jane's nephew, would write disapprovingly of this practice, though he recognized the value in the out-care system. Many babies who were provided for by a credible wet nurse would survive infancy in a time when this was not typical. But not every institution was on that level. Infants who ended up at baby farms were frequently lost in the system. Others died of neglect, or worse. Once again, working-class and single mothers were most likely to fall victim to these disreputable operations. Often, they could afford no other option. Enter Amelia Dyer, one of the most infamous baby farmers of Victorian England. Amelia Hobley was born in a small village near Bristol in 1838. She was the daughter of a successful shoemaker and was privileged enough to learn to read and write at a time when the majority of women were illiterate. Despite her relative privilege, young Amelia had a difficult childhood due to her mother's mental illness. From a very young age, Amelia was obliged to watch her mother's violent fits and care for her. In 1848, despite Amelia's best efforts, her mother died. After her mother's death, Amelia moved in with an aunt for a while. She eventually found an apprenticeship with a corset maker. In 1859, her father passed away and she became estranged to a few of her siblings. Later, she was trained as a nurse and soon began her adult life as a nurse and midwife. At age 34, she married William Dyer, a brewer's laborer from Bristol. William was her second husband. Her first, much older husband had passed away in 1869. The Dyers had 2 children together, Mary Ann, who was better known as Polly, and William Samuel. Though she eventually left her husband and not much is known about her son, Polly became something of Dyer's assistant. Her life as a midwife proved to be an arduous one, and Dyer was not keen on continuing it. It did, however, lead to her next business venture. Her friend and fellow midwife, Ellen Dane, put an idea into Dyer's head. Charging families to care for their infants was far easier and more lucrative than bringing the newborns into the world. Working under numerous aliases, Dyer put out ads in the newspaper offering a nice family with no children, quaint country home, £10. Unwed, desperate mothers responded to this seemingly respectable Mrs. Harding and be thrilled to find a good home for their children. Dyer wrote back, assuring the mother that she would do her duty by that dear child. "I will be a mother, as far as lies in my power." Once the mothers were put at ease, the baby and adoption fees were handed over. Regardless of what the mother wanted, Dyer always insisted on a full adoption with no further contact. Many a desperate mother relented. It's unclear just when Dyer's operation turned deadly. Records indicate she initially tried to care for the newborn she adopted. At some point, however, whether intentionally or not, the babies under her care began to die. A cruel math then materialized: the quicker a newly adopted infant died, the less money Dyer spent on care, and the more profit went into her pockets. Where Dyer once assisted in the process of welcoming life, she soon felt more content in her role as an angel of death. Eventually, however, one too many death certificates were issued to Dyer. A doctor grew suspicious, and authorities were alerted. In 1879, Dyer was arrested. At the time, she was charged with allowing children to die by neglect rather than manslaughter or murder. She was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor, an experience she later claimed left her mentally ill. Once released, Dyer went in and out of mental hospitals. There is evidence that Dyer began abusing alcohol and opium-based products early on in her baby farming career. At one point, Dyer drank 2 bottles of laudanum in a suicide attempt. However, her long-term abuse had built up her tolerance to opium products. She soon revisited her deadly trade. In 1890, the illegitimate baby of a governess was put under Dyer's care. When the mother returned for a visit, she realized something was wrong. The governess grew suspicious and upon further inspection decided to strip the baby to locate a birthmark on one of its hips. The baby was missing the birthmark, and an enraged mother began to question Dyer. This led to Dyer having, possibly feigning, a breakdown and entering a mental asylum. Having served as an asylum nurse, Dyer knew how to behave to ensure a comfortable environment during her time as an asylum inmate. Eventually, she also returned completely to baby farming. This time around, she took extra care to cover her tracks. She no longer called for death certificates. Bodies were wrapped in bags, weighted down with bricks, and tossed into bodies of water. Dyer and her family frequently moved through Bristol, Reading, Cardiff, and London, never remaining in one place for too long, never leaving a trace. until one cold March day in 1896. A bargeman sending cargo up the Thames in Reading noticed a box lying along the riverbank. Upon further investigation, he discovered the body of an infant within. The bargeman called the police. They confirmed that the body was that of a little girl, between 6 and 12 months old. They also discovered faint writing on the box that pointed to one Mrs. Thomas and a barely visible address. Detectives were, and had been, on to Dyer, but there was no strong evidence to link her directly to the crimes. They had collected additional evidence from witnesses and more information from Bristol police, but were unable to find any conclusive details. That is when detectives decided to use a young woman as a decoy in order to secure a meeting with Dyer to discuss her services. Whether it was designed to link Dyer to her business or as a certain opportunity to arrest her, the plan worked. On April 3, 1896, Dyer was expecting a new client. She was instead greeted by detectives outside her home. They entered and raided the home. Upon entering, authorities were apparently hit by the stench of death, though no bodies were actually discovered on the premises. What they did find, however, was a mountain of evidence, telegrams about adoption arrangements and letters from concerned mothers inquiring about the health and safety of their children. Receipts for newspaper adverts, and pawn tickets for children's clothing, and edging tape used to strangle babies to death. Authorities estimated that upwards of 20 children had been in the care of this Mrs. Thomas within the last few months alone. All told, the death toll may have been as high as 400. Amelia Dyer was arrested, charged with murder, and brought to Newgate Prison, where her plea for insanity was rejected. After a jury meeting of just 4 minutes, Dyer was condemned. On June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged outside the Newgate Prison. Dyer's disturbing story dominated headlines and soon led to stricter adoption laws. Unfortunately, the baby trafficking did not cease completely after this horrifying case. Polly, Dyer's daughter, who got off scot-free from any charges after her mother testified that she had never been involved, was rumored to continue baby farming after Amelia's hanging. A number of advertisements by a Mrs. Stewart for adoptable babies said the little one would have a good home and a parent's love and care. Many observers believed that Mrs. Stewart was Polly's pseudonym, following in a ghoulish family business she knew so well.